All right, we were just listening into this press conference there. As you can see, Department of Justice officials talking about finding civil rights violations that have been done by the Memphis Police Department. I want to show you this bump shot as well that we have of the U.S. Capitol building with this report coming out. Big deal there, and it's not the first time we've ever seen anything like this. But just for a bit of background, the Memphis Police Department, the Department of Justice says, uses excessive force and discriminates against Black people. This was after an investigation, and they're now calling on the Tennessee police to take significant reforms. So I do want to bring into the conversation now Adanté Pointer. He's a civil rights attorney. Adanté, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now. First of all, I just want to start with the investigation overall. What does investigation ultimately mean? What did the Department of Justice uncover that makes them put out a report like this?
Sure. The Department of Justice investigated to determine whether or not the Memphis PD engaged in a pattern or practice of discrimination and essentially unlawful policing, unconstitutional policing. And they figured out after conducting their investigation of about 16 months that there were rife evidence, rife patterns, many different instances that exemplify discriminatory policing, overuse of force, excessive force in particular, as well as the harmful effects, not just on the adults, citizens of the city of Memphis, but also on minors and children. And so it's very troubling to read this report and to find out the details of this report. But given how prevalent it appears that these issues are, I'd imagine to the citizens of Memphis, this is nothing new. And instead, with the receipt of this report, they're looking for action and they're looking for change.
And when we're talking about, of course, this report coming out, the Department of Justice even acknowledged that their investigation started after the July 2023 incident where Tyre Nichols, of course, that case grabbed the country's attention. So when you're talking about this, does it always take a large incident like that that makes national news to see if the Justice Department will step in to see if some changes need to be made on the local level?
Well, as we've all heard this saying before, sometimes it's the last straw that breaks the camel's back. And perhaps there have been, essentially, they found that there was a pattern of practice that was in existence prior to the incident concerning Tyre Nichols. So Tyre Nichols was essentially the match that lit the fuse. And it caught the attention of the Department of Justice. And it also brought the police department into a position where they were at least willing to cooperate into the investigation with the national spotlight trained upon them as it relates to how could something so vicious, so callous, so disturbing take place right up under the police department's nose. And in fact, that this was not the first time that something like this had happened. So oftentimes it is a big landmark watershed case that brings the attention from the federal government and calls for intervention.
It certainly does, and we're just showing some video, of course, of Tyre Nichols, the incident. We showed some body camera footage and those officers who were ultimately arrested in this case as well. But let's talk about potential civilian lawsuits. Of course, over the last few years, Tyre Nichols isn't the only person that the Department of Justice says has been inflicted, again, unnecessarily excessive force by the department there in Memphis. So civilian lawsuits, are they able to now come now that this report has been released?
Well, civilians and people who feel aggrieved or violated by the police department were always able to bring a lawsuit. So the filing of this report and its findings don't necessarily mean that any person's lawsuit is more likely to be won or for them to be compensated, or nor is it green light for them to bring lawsuits, because any lawsuit that's brought as a federal civil rights lawsuit for something that a person claims the police department did to them will have to stand on its own evidence, rise and fall based upon the credibility and the truth and the way it's presented to a judge and or a jury. So this in and of itself doesn't mean that there'll be a flood of lawsuits. What it does mean is that what many people may have been claiming took place and has happened and been asking for change, hopefully this Department of Justice report will bring that change and force the police department to engage in constitutional policing, which will hopefully at that point lead to a better Memphis for everyone to enjoy, frankly.
And Adante, I want to put this tweet back up on our screen. This is from the Associated Press. The feds have already said that they could sue to force reforms there at the Memphis Police Department if the city decides that it doesn't want to play ball in this case. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that this step might be necessary? Are there been cases where other cities have declined to make changes, and then, of course, the federal government has to do more in order to enact change?
It's very rare where you see a city essentially push away the hand of the federal government when the federal government is tasked with essentially bringing a city into compliance and in line with the Constitution. So it's not something that happens all the time, but it does happen. I think here, given the pervasive mistreatment, the pervasive violations, stopping and being very intense as it relates to the way that the police department enforces and makes police stops and traffic stops, as they say, without any legal justification or cause, and relies upon saying, well, you're present in a high crime area to justify essentially harassing people. It's, to me, very brazen and almost arrogant that the city would not take the Department of Justice up on its offer to help bring the police department into compliance. I've read things that the city has issued saying, well, they're concerned about the financial burden or it's too overly complicated. But from a person like me who studies this, to me, it's if they were in compliance and they were willing to do it without the Department of Justice stepping in, they would have already done it. And they didn't. So that's almost proof positive, if you will, Exhibit A, that they do need someone to hold them responsible, that they cannot be trusted on their own to do the right thing, and that they cannot police themselves. So I think that's what we're looking at here. And frankly, I imagine that's what the Department of Justice wants to see happen here.
All great points. Absolutely. So how does this change implementation work? What's next? What does the federal government exactly do? Is it more training for those police officers that are already on the force?
Well, I think as most things that we experience throughout life, it has to take a 360 approach. It's not just there's one silver bullet or one solution for this, because frankly, the problems and the issues not only come with training in the way of them telling officers, if someone doesn't respond to you, then you need to hit them first and hit them bad. That's the type of training that increases the aggressiveness and the escalation of police officers versus people who are using excessive force or making stops on people just to try to figure out if someone's engaged in unlawful activity. Those are different type of issues. So yes, there must be some accountability. And as we also understand, sometimes you use the carrot, but oftentimes you also need to use the stick. And the stick here would be what the Department of Justice or a court-appointed monitor would have to force the police department to do the right thing.
All right, let's talk about the election. Of course, we know that now President-elect Donald Trump will be in office in 2025. What's next, though, for Memphis police? If they decide that they don't want to comply, is there a way that, again, the president could get involved in this and make this investigation and this report and findings go away?
Well, the Department of Justice is a department of the federal government. And given the political leanings and the statements that have been issued by Donald Trump in terms of him wanting to give police officers immunity and go back to the days of them being able to knock someone's head and knock heads when you're putting somebody into a police car as a way to set the tone, you know, it's very unlikely that I would see him enforcing these type of consent decrees. And in fact, the history shows that when he was in office last time, he upended many of these consent decrees. So for the citizens of Memphis, with the changing of the presidential guard, so to speak, and Donald Trump coming back into office, it's unlikely that this type of consent decree would continue. It doesn't mean he abolished all the consent decrees. It's just that there was not the same vigor of making sure that police were following the Constitution as it has been other presidential administrations.
Very interesting to think that, again, this is a Department of Justice investigation that had already gone on. It could end up going away just because there's a new president in office. Certainly something that we're going to continue to follow here on Live Now from Fox. Adanté, before I let you go, do you have any further comments or that you would like to make about the situation?
Well, you know, I think at the end of the day, all parties concerned, if they're truly being genuine and want to adhere to the principles contained in the Constitution, would want to see constitutional policing in the city of Memphis. And so all people have to come together, all stakeholders, in order to make that happen. Unfortunately, we've seen time and time again, policing is being drugged into being something that's constitutional in 21st century. That's the type of culture that we're trying to overcome. And frankly, we all would be better for it once that happens.
Attorney Adanté Pointer there, civil rights attorney, giving us the very latest to break down what's happening there in Memphis with this new Department of Justice report release. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.